March 9th, 1945, Tokyo. It was 11:48 p.m. when Major General Sei Arasue, Chief of Intelligence for the Imperial Japanese Army, paused by his window in the War Ministry building. Outside, searchlights crisscrossed the night sky like restless blades, cutting through the haze that hung over the sleeping capital. The air raid sirens had begun their mournful wail 8 minutes earlier, a sound so familiar now that few in Tokyo even flinched. For months, the giant American B-29 superfortresses had come and gone, dropping their bombs from altitudes so high the city's defenses could barely scratch them. The results had been painful but tolerable. A few aircraft factories lost, a few hundred civilian deaths. The city endured. But tonight, something felt different. At 11:53, Arasue's aide burst into the room, breathless, eyes wide. "Sir, the observation posts are reporting something unusual." "What kind of unusual?" "The B-29, sir. They're flying low, very low." For a moment, Arasue just stared at him. Low-altitude bombing made no tactical sense. The Americans had spent months mastering high-altitude precision raids to stay beyond the reach of Japanese guns. Flying low over Tokyo's dense anti-aircraft grid was suicide. "How low?" he demanded. 5,000 to 7,000 feet, sir, maybe lower." "And there aren't dozens anymore. There are hundreds." Outside, the first explosions began to bloom on the horizon, orange fireballs rising against the black sky, and within minutes, Tokyo would descend into an inferno unlike anything the world had ever seen. Through the window, Arasue saw the first clusters of incendiaries ignite, not the usual high-explosive bombs, but thousands of small fires blooming across the Shitamachi district like deadly flowers. The working-class neighborhoods east of the Sumida River were wooden houses pressed against each other in dense warren where 1 million people slept. By midnight, the fires had merged into a single mass. Arasue could feel the heat through the glass. Though the inferno was miles away, the wind that night was blowing at 30 miles per hour, driving the flames through the narrow streets faster than people could run. The phone on his desk rang constantly. Reports from fire brigades, police stations, military posts, each one more desperate than the last. The fires were creating their own weather system, generating winds so powerful they were tearing people off their feet and hurling them into the flames. At the Imperial Palace, barely 2 miles from the War Ministry, Emperor Hirohito had been awakened by his chamberlain at midnight. The emperor, 44 years old, stood at the window of his private quarters, watching the eastern sky turn orange. He said nothing for several minutes. Behind him, Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Koichi, waited, unsure whether to speak. "How many aircraft?" the emperor finally asked. "The reports are still coming in, Your Majesty. At least 200, possibly 300. The emperor's hands, Kido noticed, were trembling slightly. "And they are using incendiaries." "Yes, Your Majesty." Hirohito had studied military science since childhood. He understood what incendiaries meant when dropped on a city where 90% of the structures were wood. He understood what 300 bombers could do in a single night. "Summon the War Council," he said quietly. "I want to know what is happening. All of it." But the War Council couldn't assemble. War Minister General Kenrichi Anami was at his residence in western Tokyo, cut off by the spreading fires. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai was trapped at the Navy Ministry building. Chief of the Army General Staff Yoshiro Umezu was at Imperial General Headquarters receiving fragmentary reports that contradicted each other. Some said the fires were under control. Others said entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. At 1:15 in the morning, Arisu received a call from the commander of the 1st Anti-Aircraft Division. The man was shouting to be heard over the roar of flames in the background. "We can't stop them. They're too low and there are too many. Our guns can't traverse fast enough. The fire is—" The line went dead. The B-29s kept coming for 2 more hours. They flew in streams, one after another, each dropping clusters of M69 incendiary bombs, 6-pound cylinders filled with napalm that burst into white-hot flames on impact. Each bomber carried 40 clusters, Each cluster held 38 bomb blitz. Do the mathematics. 334 bombers, each dropping more than 500 individual firebombs. 500,000 separate fires ignited across 16 square miles of the most densely populated urban area on Earth. Major Yoshitaka Harui, a staff officer at Imperial General Headquarters, was on duty that night in the underground command center. He watched the reports accumulate on the situation map. Red pins for fires, black pins for destroyed fire stations, white pins for hospitals overwhelmed with casualties. By 2 in the morning, there were so many pins the map was barely visible beneath them. "Get me casualty estimates," ordered a subordinate. The young lieutenant looked at him helplessly. "Sir, the police can't reach most of the affected areas. The fires are still burning. The bridges across the Sumida are jammed with people trying to escape. Some of the bridges have collapsed from the heat. We have reports of people jumping into the river and boiling to death because the water itself is heating up." Hai felt his stomach turn. He'd served in China. He'd seen what war did to cities. But this was different. This was Tokyo, his city, the heart of the empire. "Give me your best estimate."
The lieutenant consulted his notes, his hands shaking. Based on population density in the affected areas and the percentage of structures destroyed, tens of thousands dead, sir. Maybe more, maybe many more. At 3:30 in the morning, the last B-29 departed. The fires burned on. They would burn for 4 more days. As dawn broke on March 10th, General Anami finally reached the War Ministry. He'd walked the last 3 miles because the roads were impassable. His uniform was covered in ash. His face was streaked with soot and sweat. He found Aresitsu in his office, still standing at the window, watching smoke rise from the ruins. "Show me," Anami said. They drove east in a military car as close as the fires would allow. At the edge of the burn zone, Anami got out and walked forward. The heat was still intense enough to make breathing difficult. What had been streets were now corridors between walls of ash. Bodies lay everywhere. Most were burned beyond recognition. Some had been caught in the open and were now charred shapes barely identifiable as human. Others had sought shelter in canals and water tanks, where they'd been boiled alive. Still others had been asphyxiated by the smoke before the flames reached them, and these looked almost peaceful, as if sleeping, except for their blue lips and the way their hands clutched at their throats. Anami, who had commanded troops in some of the worst fighting in China and Manchuria, who had seen cities burn and civilians die, stood in the ruins of Tokyo and wept. Not openly, not dramatically, just tears running down his ash-stained face as he surveyed the destruction. "How many?" he asked quietly. "We don't know yet, sir. The fires are still too intense to conduct proper searches. But based on the population density of the Shitamachi district and the extent of the destruction," Aresitsu paused. 80,000 at minimum, possibly more than 100,000. 100,000 dead in a single night. More than Hiroshima would kill 5 months later. More than any military action in human history up to that point. Anami closed his eyes. "And the bombers?" 14 lost, sir, out of more than 300. 14, less than 5%. The Americans had traded 14 aircraft and perhaps 140 crewmen for 100,000 Japanese civilians. The mathematics of it was obscene, and the strategic implications were worse. The War Council finally convened at noon on March 10th in an emergency session at the Imperial Palace. They met in an underground bunker, though the fires were miles away now. Emperor Hirohito attended personally, which was unusual. Normally, he remained silent during these meetings, a symbolic presence, while his ministers debated. Today, he spoke first. "Explain to me what happened last night." General Umesu, chief of the Army General Staff, stood to brief. He was 62 years old, a career military man who had spent 40 years preparing for war. Nothing in that preparation had equipped him for this. "Your Majesty, at approximately 11:50, American B-29 bombers began attacking Tokyo with incendiary bombs. The attack lasted approximately 2.5 hours. The bombers flew at unusually low altitude, between 5 and 9,000 feet, which reduced the effectiveness of our anti-aircraft defenses. They dropped M69 incendiary cluster bombs designed to start fires in wooden structures. The bombs were highly effective. Strong winds that night, gusting to 30 miles per hour, spread the fires rapidly through the Shitamachi district." "Casualties?" the emperor asked. "Still being assessed, Your Majesty. Preliminary estimates suggest tens of thousands dead, possibly exceeding 100,000. Perhaps as many as 1 million people are now homeless. 16 square miles of the city have been destroyed. The room was silent. Navy Minister Yonai, who had opposed the war from the beginning, stared at his hands. Prime Minister Kuniaki Koisoa looked as if he might be sick. War Minister Anemi stood rigid, his face expressionless. And our response, the Emperor continued. Umezu glanced at Anemi, who stepped forward. Your Majesty, we shot down 14 enemy bombers. Our night fighter units engaged where possible, but the Americans attacked in a concentrated stream that overwhelmed our defenses. Our anti-aircraft guns were effective at low altitude, but there were simply too many targets. The fire spread too quickly for our fire brigades to contain them. The wind created a firestorm effect that made firefighting impossible in many areas.
14 aircraft, the Emperor said quietly. Out of how many? Intelligence estimates 334 bombers participated in the raid. Your Majesty. The Emperor looked at Anami directly. General, I want you to understand what I'm asking. The Americans lost 14 aircraft to kill 100,000 of my subjects and destroy 16 square miles of my capital. What does this tell us about their capability to continue such attacks? Anami understood perfectly. The Emperor was asking whether Japan could survive a sustained campaign of such raids, whether the war was still winnable, whether continuing to fight made any strategic sense at all. Your Majesty, Anami began carefully. The Americans have approximately 500 B-29 bombers in the Marianas. If they can sustain this operational tempo, they could attack every major city in Japan within a matter of months. Our air defenses are inadequate against mass low-altitude incendiary raids. Our fighter strength is depleted. We lack the fuel and pilots to mount effective interceptions, and our cities, as Your Majesty knows, are particularly vulnerable to fire. Then we must evacuate the cities, said Prime Minister Kiyoso. Move the population to the countryside, disperse the industrial facilities. General Umezu shook his head. Evacuate 12 million people from the major cities? With what transportation? To where? And how would we feed them? Our rice production is already insufficient. Moving millions more people into agricultural areas would create mass starvation. Then what do you propose? Kiyoso demanded. The question hung in the air. What could they propose? The Americans controlled the seas around Japan. They controlled the skies above Japan. They could burn Japanese cities at will, and there was nothing the imperial military could do to stop them. Admiral Yunai spoke for the first time. Gentlemen, I believe we must face certain realities. Last night's raid was not an isolated incident. It was a demonstration of capability. The Americans have shown us that they can destroy our cities whenever they choose. They have shown us that our defenses cannot stop them. And they have shown us that they are willing to use this capability without restraint. He paused, looking around the table. The question is not whether they will continue these attacks. They will. The question is whether we can achieve any of our war aims before they burn every city in Japan to the ground. We fight on, Anami said firmly. We make them pay for every foot of Japanese soil. We make the cost of invasion so high that they will negotiate rather than continue. Last night was terrible, yes, but the Japanese people are strong. They will endure. They will sacrifice. And when the Americans finally attempt to land troops on our shores, we will destroy them on the beaches. With what forces? Yunai asked quietly. Our best divisions are scattered across the Pacific, cut off and starving. Our Navy barely exists. Our Air Force is reduced to training obsolete aircraft for kamikaze missions. And now our cities are burning. What exactly will we fight with, General? Anami's face flushed with anger. We fight with the spirit of Yamato. We fight with the courage of the samurai. We fight because surrender is unthinkable.
Spirit does not stop incendiary bombs, Yonai replied. Emperor Hirohito raised his hand slightly, and both men fell silent. I wish to tour the damaged areas, he said. I wish to see for myself what has been done to my capital and my people. The ministers exchanged glances. The emperor never left the palace grounds during wartime. Security concerns made it impossible.
But Hirohito's tone made clear this was not a request. "Your Majesty," Kido said carefully, "the situation in the affected areas is still chaotic. Fires are still burning. Bodies have not been recovered. It would be dangerous and distressing." "I will see it," the emperor said flatly. On March 18th, 8 days after the raid, Emperor Hirohito toured the ruins of Tokyo. His motorcade drove through streets lined with ash and rubble. The fires had finally burned out, but the smell of death hung heavy in the air. Recovery teams were still pulling bodies from the ruins. Survivors wandered through the wreckage, searching for anything salvageable. Some looked up as the imperial car passed. Most were too exhausted or traumatized to react. The emperor's chamberlain, who accompanied him, later wrote in his diary, "His Majesty said nothing during the entire tour. He looked at the ruins, at the survivors, at the recovery teams carrying bodies. When we returned to the palace, he went immediately to his private quarters. I heard later that he wept." What the emperor saw that day was the end of the world he had known. The Tokyo of his childhood, of his father's reign, of 1,000 years of imperial tradition gone, reduced to ash in a single night, and the Americans had barely begun. Between March 10th and the end of May, B-29s returned again and again. Nagoya burned on March 11th. Osaka burned on March 13th. Kobe burned on March 16th. Nagoya burned again on March 19th. Each raid followed the same pattern. Hundreds of bombers, low altitude, incendiary bombs. Tens of thousands dead. By the end of May, every major city in Japan except Kyoto had been attacked. More than 250,000 civilians were dead. Millions were homeless. The industrial capacity that remained after years of naval blockade was being systematically destroyed. In the War Ministry, the debates continued. General Aun still argued for fighting on, for making the Americans pay such a high price for invasion that they would negotiate a conditional surrender. But his arguments grew more desperate as the casualty reports mounted. The mathematics of attrition that had always favored Japan in defensive warfare no longer applied when the enemy could simply burn your cities from the air. Major Hori, the staff officer who had been on duty the night of March 10th, attended many of these planning sessions. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "By April, we all knew the war was lost. The question was no longer whether we would lose, but how many more Japanese would die before we admitted defeat." General Aun spoke of honor and sacrifice. But when I looked at the casualty reports, I saw only numbers. 80,000 here, 50,000 there. The numbers stopped meaning anything after a while. They were just abstractions. But then I would remember that night, watching the pins accumulate on the map.
And I would realize that each number was a person, a mother, a father, a child, and we were letting them die for a war we knew we could not win. General Arasur, the intelligence chief who had watched the first fires from his window, reached his own conclusion by mid-April. He began compiling a report for the War Council titled Assessment of American Strategic Bombing Capability and Implications for Continued Resistance. The report was brutally honest. The Americans had demonstrated the ability to destroy Japanese cities at will. Japanese air defenses were inadequate and growing weaker as fuel and aircraft became scarce. Civilian morale was deteriorating, industrial production was collapsing, and the Americans showed no sign of stopping. The report's conclusion was carefully worded but unmistakable. Continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of Japan's urban centers and the deaths of millions of civilians without any realistic prospect of achieving favorable peace terms. When Arasur presented the report to General Umezu in late April, the Chief of Staff read it in silence, then looked up. "You are recommending surrender." "I am recommending that we face reality, sir. Last night Yokohama burned. 17 square miles destroyed, perhaps 14,000 dead. The Americans did this with less than 500 bombers in 2 hours. They have shown us what they can do. They will continue to do it, and we cannot stop them." Umezu set the report down. "The army will not accept surrender. You know this. General Anami will never agree. Many of the younger officers would rather see Japan destroyed than admit defeat. Some are already talking about a coup if the government attempts to surrender. Then Japan will be destroyed, Arasura said quietly, because the Americans will not stop. They have the capability and the will to burn every city in Japan. And after the cities are gone, they will burn the towns. And after the towns are gone, they will burn the villages. And when there is nothing left to burn, they will invade and millions more will die fighting a battle we cannot win. Umezu stared at the report for a long moment. I will present this to the War Council, but I cannot promise they will listen. The momentum of war has its own logic. Sometimes it is easier to continue fighting than to admit you have lost. The War Council met again on May 8th. Germany had surrendered the day before, ending the war in Europe. Now the full weight of Allied military power would turn toward Japan. The implications were obvious to everyone in the room. Gentlemen, Prime Minister Kiso began, we must discuss our strategic position in light of recent developments. Our position is clear, Anami interrupted. We fight on. We prepare for the decisive battle when the Americans attempt to invade the home islands. We mobilize every able-bodied citizen. We turn Japan into a fortress. We make them pay such a price that they will negotiate rather than continue. And how many Japanese will die in this decisive battle? Yonai asked. As many as necessary, Anami replied. The alternative is surrender, which is unthinkable. Is it? Yonai leaned forward. General, since March 10th, the Americans have killed more than 250,000 civilians in air raids. They have destroyed 67 cities. They have made millions of our people homeless. They have crippled our industrial capacity. And they have done all of this while losing fewer than 500 aircraft. These are facts. Now, you propose that we continue fighting until they invade, at which point we will fight a battle that will kill millions more Japanese? For what? What do we gain? What do we achieve except more death? We preserve our honor, Anami said. Honor? Yonai's voice rose. I watched Tokyo burn from the Navy Ministry building. I saw the sky turn orange. I smelled the smoke. I read the casualty reports. Tell me, General, what honor is there in letting our people die for a war we cannot win? Anami stood abruptly. The Navy has no right to speak of honor.
You lost the Pacific. You lost our carriers. You lost our fleet. The Army has been fighting and winning for 40 years. And now you want us to surrender because you failed? Gentlemen, Emperor Hirohito's voice cut through the argument. Both men turned, shocked. The Emperor never intervened in these debates. Sit down, both of you. They sat. Hirohito looked at each man in turn. I have heard these arguments before. They do not change. General Anami believes we must fight on. Admiral Yanai believes we must seek peace. Prime Minister Koisu attempts to find middle ground. And while you argue, my people die. He paused. I toured Tokyo. I saw what the Americans did. I saw the bodies. I saw the survivors. I saw children orphaned, families destroyed, a city reduced to ash. And I know that this will continue. The Americans will burn every city in Japan if we let them. Soon they have shown us this. Your Majesty, Anami began, if we surrender, I am not finished, General. The Emperor's voice was quiet but firm. You speak of honor and sacrifice. You speak of the decisive battle. But I have seen enough death. I have seen enough sacrifice. And I wonder whether continuing this war serves Japan or merely serves our pride. The room was utterly silent. I do not order you to surrender, Hirohito continued. Not yet. But I order you to think carefully about what you are asking the Japanese people to endure. And I order you to remember that your duty is not to preserve your honor, but to preserve Japan. The meeting adjourned without resolution, but something had shifted.
The emperor had spoken more directly than ever before about the possibility of ending the war, and everyone in the room understood what that meant. In the weeks that followed, the firebombing continued. The debate in the War Council continued, and the death toll mounted. General Anami remained adamant about fighting on. Admiral Yunai became increasingly vocal about seeking peace. The emperor watched and waited, knowing that eventually he would have to make a decision that would change Japan forever. On the night of March 9th, standing at his window, watching the first fires bloom over Tokyo, General Arebenis had understood immediately what was happening. This was not just another air raid. This was the beginning of the end. The Americans had found a way to destroy Japan without ever landing a soldier on Japanese soil. They would burn the cities, kill the civilians, break the will to resist. And there was nothing the imperial military could do to stop them. Now, 2 months later, with dozens of cities destroyed and hundreds of thousands dead, the rest of Japan's leadership was finally reaching the same conclusion. The war was lost. The only question was, how many more would die before they admitted it? General Anami would never admit it. He would argue for continued resistance until the very end. On August 15th, after the emperor announced Japan's surrender, Anami would commit ritual suicide rather than accept defeat. His final words would be an apology to the emperor for failing to achieve victory. But on that night in March, watching Tokyo burn, some part of him must have known. The firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of his capital in a single night was not just destroying buildings and killing civilians. It was destroying the illusion that Japan could still win this war. It was destroying the belief that spirit and sacrifice could overcome industrial might and technological superiority. It was destroying the world that men like Anami had built their entire lives around. The fires burned for 4 days. The debate in the War Council would burn for 5 more months. And in the end, it would take 2 atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria to finally force the decision that should have been made on March 10th.
By dawn, Tokyo was no longer a city. It was a graveyard of ash and silence. The fires had burned through the night, devouring everything in their path. Wooden houses had become furnaces, rivers had turned to steam, and entire districts had vanished into smoke. And somewhere amid the ruins, General Anami stood, watching recovery teams pull charred bodies from what had once been streets. His uniform was coated in gray dust, his face streaked with soot and tears. He wept, not for the dead, though they were beyond counting, not for the capital, which now existed only as rubble and memory. He wept for Japan itself, for the future he could already see unfolding, a future his nation was powerless to stop. That night, the Americans had done more than destroy a city. They had revealed the true shape of modern war, a war fought not with courage and steel, but with industry, machines, and fire. They had shown that honor, discipline, and sacrifice meant nothing against napalm and high explosives dropped from 30,000 feet. And in those ashes, Japan's high command finally understood what they had done. They had begun a war they could never win. They had continued a war they should have ended long ago. And now their people, the innocent, the faithful, the loyal, were paying the price for their pride in blood and flame. The question was no longer if Japan would lose. It was how many more nights like March 9th would burn before its leaders finally found the courage to face the truth. That the empire they had sworn to defend was already dead.